Let's talk about investing in college or higher education versus investing money into the market or investing in yourself by learning on your own and skipping college. Now, this channel touches upon all these subjects, right? I just don't teach code. I teach business lessons, freelance lessons. I teach the real world life, if you will, of a developer, whether you work for somebody or do stuff on your own. I've been doing this stuff for long enough, so I figured I would share my knowledge. So there's an article I was reading by Sheila Bair. She was a former FDIC chair, very high-level government official in the U.S. government. I know there's a worldwide audience, so I'm not going to get into that kind of detail, but let me just read you some of the bullet points. This is somebody in the know. And she's talking about college education and the cost of college education in the U.S. This doesn't apply if you're in Europe or in Canada so much, in some ways, but we'll get into it. So she says, it is commonly said that a college degree will generate more than $1 million in additional income during a graduate's lifetime. She says, indeed, that's a seductive statistic that can even be found on the Department of Education's website. Unfortunately, I fear many students and their families have borrowed heavily, lured by this seven-figure college premium. Yet, this premium is on average and varies widely by the choice of major. Basically, I'm not going to read everything she says word for word, but what she's saying is that to be able to make this extra $1 million by going to college, you have to go to very specific fields. If you're going into art history and women's studies, any of the arts, you're not going to get that. And unfortunately, a lot of students find themselves in these type of degrees where you don't get the big paying jobs, but they got the big debt. The types of degrees where you get the premium would be in engineering, software development, healthcare, etc. Let me deal with the software development in a second. So this huge amount of debt that students have incurred in the U.S. is $1.5 trillion in student loan debt. Now, this is having a tremendous bad impact in terms of the future economy in the U.S. because typically when students would come out of school, they would buy their first house, driving the housing market, they would buy a car, etc. But now the students, because they got so much debt, student loan debt, they can't afford any of this, so it's really having a negative impact on the economy. The problem with this debt, and one of the most pernicious things, pernicious is another word for evil, one of the most pernicious things about the student loan debt is that it's not dischargeable through bankruptcy, meaning you can't go bankrupt to lose the debt. You're stuck with this debt around your neck the rest of your life. So I always warn people, do not get into student loan debt. Do not get into student loan debt unless you're like 100,000% sure you're going to come out with your medical degree that pays huge salary, or your engineering degree, which pays a big salary. The big mistake, a big problem that people run into is they come out of school with 30, 40, 50, 100,000, 200,000 in debt, and they don't have a degree that's worth anything. And then they can't get rid of this debt, which is crazy, and now they're done. It's like they're debt slaves, which is like something that I thought we got rid of 75 years ago because the world figured out, at least in the Western world, figured out that debt slavery was not good for anybody. Let me read a couple of bullet points here. The vast majority of student loans are made by the government but arranged by the colleges, which are well-intentioned, so she says, but better equipped to educate than originate loans. I would say the vast majority of people working at the colleges are well-intentioned. The problem is that they have their fiefdoms. They're going to pay lots of salaries to administrators. If you look at some of the numbers, it could be pretty disastrous about how many administrators are involved to manage a certain limited number of students. You know, as a business owner, I would be, what? That makes no sense. But let me go on. The article continues. A decade after affordable mortgage borrowing brought our economy to its knees, talking about the U.S. economy, See, everybody borrowed a whole bunch of money to buy houses, and drove the house prices way up beyond what they were really worth, and then the whole thing collapsed because it was just a giant scam. We're seeing something similar, I think, in this is my commentary here, in terms of student loans. So let me start that sentence again. A decade after unaffordable mortgage borrowing brought the U.S. economy to its knees. I'm not American, but I'm Canadian, so I see everything. Half my family Americans. We face a new kind of crisis. As student loan debt now exceeds $1.5 trillion, it's even bigger than I thought, with nearly 40% of borrowers expected to default by 2023. Holy jeez, 40% are going to default over the next few years. That means they can't afford their debt. That means that 40% of the students took on student loan debt that they shouldn't have taken on, right? Because they can't afford to pay. It means they didn't complete it, or they didn't take degrees, they didn't take courses or degrees that were worth it. Instead of enticing our youth with the promise of million-dollar riches, policymakers should ensure that they have the skills and information needed to make cost-effective educational choices. It's immoral that students, 17, 18, 19, 20-year-old students, 22-year-old students, are making these very, 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 very dangerous, life-altering financial decisions. That's not right. They're not, when I was 19 or 20, well, I had some knowledge because I was running my own business, but most people are financially illiterate. Most people don't have the wherewithal to be able to make these type of decisions. It's crazy that they do this. Oh, yeah, you're going to take this philosophy degree. It's only going to cost you $30,000 a year. And then they're $100,000 in debt. And, you're not going to make any money with philosophy. And then what they do is they do a studio web course to become coders, and then they pay off their debt pretty quick. But that's another story. Okay, a little shameless plug, sorry. Anyway, let me finish off. Most college degrees will produce a solid income premium. On the other hand, that's what they say in this article, maybe. On the other hand, the average cost of a 4-year degree at a private college is about $160,000 US dollars. 4 years, $160,000. Investing that money at 5% over a 40-year career would also yield well over $1 million. So if you could take that money, invest it, and leave it for 40 years, you'd be ahead of somebody who took that money, got a degree, and then worked. So you could take that money, invest it, don't do anything for 40 years, and you're ahead of the person who took that money, bought a college degree, and then had to work those 40 years. Now, you have to come up with the $160,000, but there's something to be said about that. So final point, how much time do I got here? Final point, college is an enriching experience and should be broadly accessible. Factors beyond monetary considerations may drive students' decisions to attend, but they should be able to decide with their eyes open about the financial burden they are undertaking and its likely reward. So that last line I like. But they should be able to decide with their eyes wide open about the financial burden they are undertaking and its likely reward. So what does that all mean? That means transparency. That's something that we see a lot of the times where people try to hide the details of the contracts, if you will, the realities of the situation from people who are putting their money in. And so the students, I don't think they're being lured in mischievously, I suppose, but they're just not made aware of what the reality of the situation is. So they say. I don't know. When I was going to college, and I'm in Canada, it was super cheap. Instead of, $40,000 a year or 50, it was like $3,000 a year. It was nothing. And I went into student loan debt, and I paid it off. But it was pernicious debt too. You couldn't get rid of it. So number one, if you're a student loan debt, that's the debt you got to pay off. You got to pay off because you can't let that grow because you can never get rid of it. Number two, let us consider, as I mentioned in a previous video, and I'll link to it below, where I talked about salaries of people who went to college and studied software engineering, computer science, versus people who just jumped into the game after doing like a program, like a studio web type of training. I showed you that in San Francisco even, it doesn't matter whether you're doing PHP or Python AI or Java. After 3-4 years, the salaries are all about the same. And the thing with the web stack, whether you do web stack PHP, web stack Ruby, web stack Python, web stack Java, JavaScript, of course, Node. My 2 top choices, by the way, would be PHP and Node and JavaScript in terms of the web stack. And then, who knows? And then, well, it depends on what you're doing. But I'm not going to get into that. I've talked about that before. But point being is that without getting a college degree, without having to incur all that debt, you can jump into the game as a professional web developer within a very short period of time. Now, I say months to be give everybody a lot of room to breathe and so on, but you've probably seen, or you may have seen under certain YouTube videos, people have, my students have, within a month, within weeks of doing my course, found jobs. And they're entry-level jobs, but they said at the time they paid well. And you quickly ramp up in terms of your salary. That's the thing about the web stack development and programming, is that it's based on skill. Now, it'd be good to have maybe a couple of certificates here and there. Not crucial, but but once you get in, man, the money starts going well without the degree and everything. And the point I want to make is that if you go to a college to get a higher education, you're looking at 3-4 years, right? Meanwhile, you do like self-teach, you learn the basics of the web stack, you jump into work right away within months. So by the time the person gets out of college, you're 4 years in. You've already been earning and gaining experience for 4 years. So you have to ask yourself, and the younger students are going to ask themselves, well, did somebody went to college? Did they gain special knowledge that I don't have? No, not at all. Probably the opposite. I know 5 friends now who have, they're engineers. And all of them will tell you, as they told me, that they didn't learn much in engineering school. They learned on the job. That's it. A lot of times the curriculums meaning the set of courses, the things that they teach in a lot of colleges, they're especially when it comes to tech stuff, it's dated. Be very careful about student loan debt. If you are in college now and you're halfway there, and the debt that you're incurring is very manageable, then fine, finish it. It doesn't hurt to have a degree, that's for sure. Although they are losing their value. They're becoming less and less valuable every year, simply because of supply and demand, and because, as I pointed out in a previous video, Google said, they did a study, and they found internally that the performance difference between college-educated Google employees versus non-college educated Google employees, there was no difference. They found that the people who didn't go to college working at Google were just as good as people going to college. So what does that tell you? When the biggest tech company, in the top 2 in the world, says that it doesn't matter whether people went to college to, in terms of their abilities, people are going to start going, wait a second. If people who didn't go to college are just as good as people who did go to college, why do we care about if somebody went to college, right? We should just judge people based on what they can do themselves, what they can show that they can do. And there's other evidence of that. You hear about Peter Thiel, billionaire co-founder of PayPal. He says the same thing. He says that college is, a waste of time. I'm not dissing on all college. There's certain areas where college really comes in handy. Not all colleges are equal. It comes down to, at the end of the day, it comes down to the teacher. Another thing I want to point out, in a Forbes article, and I'll try to link to these 2 articles below in the comment section, below the video. A Forbes article came out last year where they're talking about how these Ivy League universities were putting out their curriculums online. And and people could take their stuff online. I forget if it could have been Harvard or others. And you do it, and you do the exact same curriculum online as the brick and mortar students, the students who go to the normal version of the school. But you do it for like $1,000 a year instead of $50,000 a year. And after 4 years, the people who did it online only wouldn't get a degree, but they get a certificate. But it was the same exact training. And in the Forbes article, Forbes magazine, if you don't know what that is, the magazine, famous, it's all about business and so forth. And they made two major points in that article. That A, the colleges had to do this because that was the future of education, online. Studio Web represents the future of education. Number two, well, they didn't mention Studio Web in Forbes, but you get Studio Web represents that type of education. Anyway, another point they made out was that the value of college degrees, according to Forbes, and of course I agree, will drop over time simply because as more and more students are trained online and as more and more employers, as more and more companies see that it doesn't make a difference whether they got an official degree or they just did it online, all of a sudden when they start hiring people like Google, when they start hiring people who don't have a college degree and are still really good, then all of a sudden the value of these degrees are going to diminish quite a bit. In life, you'll see that things come in and out of vogue, meaning things will be very hot and be very valuable, and then next thing you know, all of a sudden the market changes and everything is not valuable. A good example of that was the cryptocurrency space. It was like a very shortened, compressed example of how we saw something that shot up and went up tremendously in value, went up to like 19,000 a coin, a Bitcoin, and it's since dropped to in the 3,000 range. I think it recently popped up a little bit. And who knows what will happen with that, but you can see how emotional sentiment, how the perception of value can change very quickly. We've seen that in locations. For instance, in 30 years ago in Detroit, you'd have all these beautiful houses that cost, huge amounts of money. Now you can pick up huge, massive houses that in Montreal would cost you $2-3 million. You get them in Detroit for $50,000, right? Things change. So I believe and I predict that the value of college education, higher education, will diminish quite a bit over the next decade or so and going forward. And I think eventually the way it's going to go, in my opinion, in terms of education, and I come from a family of teachers. My father's a teacher, many of my aunts, uncles, cousins. That's why I teach. It's in our blood. I believe you're going to see the whole perception of higher education change. I think it's still going to be there, that's for sure, but it's going to be very, very different. So I assume that you're watching this channel because you're interested in technology. And as I said, if you're from Europe or you're from a part of the world where the education is free and you like it, then do it. But if you're from the U.S. where you can find yourself in massive debt, then I would not do it. Boot camps, I would not do it, especially $10,000, $12,000 boot camps. I've had several boot camp students tell me that they learned much more from my IWD full stack course, which costs $30 odd dollars versus the $10,000 boot camp. At the end of the day, it was my point. I just forgot my point. At the end of the day, the quality of the education comes down to the quality of the teacher. Prior to, go back 100 years, 125 years ago or more, people would seek out teachers of gravitas, would seek out the top teachers. And outside of the educational institutions, they would seek out the master, if you will, and want their kids to train with the masters. I was reading about that with regards to in Europe, in the 1800s, where the famous composers, Mozart and Beethoven, etc., they would make their money teaching rich kids. So the families would send their kids to train with Mozart. So Mozart and the other musicians would compose their symphonies and so forth, but they make their money teaching the students how to play music. Anyhow, that's, I think, pretty much it. It's a long vlog. I hope this is useful for you guys. So consider the facts on the ground before you jump into education. Consider where I believe the market is going, where I believe college education's value will continue to diminish and to diminish. I think real skills, provable skills, are going to become much more important, and it is today. Like, if you learn the web stack, you develop a good portfolio, put up a good site, you get some stuff on GitHub, you do a couple of small freebie contracts, maybe get a couple quick little certifications, to help pad the resume to get going. And then from there, man, you can just head out into the workforce, start building your reputation, building your skills. You really build the majority of your skills working on real projects, and you'll be in a good position. And as they say up here in Canada, Bob's your uncle.